One important way to think about what's happened recently in the Episcopal Church is the analogy of an iceberg. I think what's occurred is a trap for people in the sense that what gets noticed is the part above the water, which is sex. It gets all the headlines, it sells all the paper, and it's what people think that the controversy is primarily about. But just as in an iceberg, when it's the little tip that you can see above the water, it's the part that's below the water that's attached to the tip that's the thing that actually sinks the ship. And this situation is exactly like that. It is about sex, but it's about so much more than sex. And sex is actually the symptom of a spiritual disease that is very, very deep and profound. If you think about sex being above the water, the first level beneath the water is the crisis of humanness and the doctrine of creation. What does it actually mean to be a human being created in the image of God? When God made everything good, what did he make and why was it good? And then how has that been corrupted by the fall and by sin? What does it mean to be a man or a woman? And those are the only two things that God made. Those are profound questions. Another element of it is the whole doctrine of marriage, which is something that the church has really woefully neglected in recent years in terms of its teaching. But the church historically has seen marriage as a very rich and important thing. It's a relationship that is about the union of a man and a woman. It's about the communion of a man and a woman. It's about the procreation and provision of children. And it's also about the prevention of sin. And all of those dimensions of what marriage is are at stake in any marital relationship. That's what marriage is intended to be, is all those things. And the problem with the relationship in which the current leader of the Diocese of New Hampshire is involved is it's not a marriage. And here you have a group of people who have invented a whole new category of human relationships. I mean, the church has always said there's only two states of human existence, single and married. And the church's standard is faithfulness in marriage, right? And chastity for those who are single. And abstinence, if you want to use another word for those who are single. But that's been the church's standard. And now you've got a new relationship. If it's marriage, then you have to overhaul the whole doctrine of marriage. If it's not marriage, then you have to explain what it is. And the church has never said that there is any such thing, that the church should be about encouraging. Another dimension of what's under the water, with sex as the tip of the iceberg, is the whole issue of authority in the church. Who makes decisions and who has the authority to make decisions? And Anglicans historically have always been a conciliar church. We believe that the way God works in decision-making is through councils. It's messy, vestry meetings, diocesan conventions, general conventions, primates meetings, Lambeth conferences. This is the way that God actually works. And part of what it means to think this way about the church is the more important a decision, the more widely you consult. And here you have a situation where we're going to change the church's doctrine of marriage. And one member communion of a 38-member family is unilaterally changing the church's teaching on family, marriage, and human sexuality, and doing it without meaningfully consulting any of the others. No wonder that they're so upset. This decision should not simply have been made locally. It should have been made internationally, and it wasn't. A further way to think about what's under the water with sex as the tip of the iceberg is the whole issue of Scripture. And this is really a controversy about the way that Scripture is interpreted and how Scripture has authority. And again, one of the traps is it's just about a few isolated verses, and it's not. Scripture, like any good book, is actually meant to be understood as a whole. One of the things I like to say to people is a text without a context is a pretext. But the Bible's a good book. It fits together as a piece of literature as a whole. And the message of Scripture is very clear. God creates the world, and he creates human beings, and he places them in the world, and he gives them context for human intimacy. And the context that he provides is marriage. It's always been that way. It's man and woman in the garden. It's a man and woman in the Song of Solomon, which is a celebration of human intimacy. It's a man and woman in the teaching of Jesus again and again. In the controversy in Mark 10 about divorce, back he goes to Genesis. Paul talks about marriage as an analogy for the relationship between Christ and the church. And then you get to Revelation at the end of history, and it's marriage yet again, the relationship between Jesus and his bride. So this emphasis on marriage as a whole way of looking at the world and the relationship between Christ and his church is very much in the forefront of what is being threatened by this unchristian change. The last dimension, which is the most important, is I believe that nothing less is at stake than the gospel itself. That is to say, what is the message of Jesus that he brought to the world, and what is the message that the church is going to bring to people at the beginning of the 21st century? And the reality is, if you listen closely in the Episcopal Church, many of the same words are being used, but it's not a biblical gospel. It's not a story of salvation and transformation. It's a different story. It's a gospel of inclusion and affirmation. And so what you get in something like the story of the woman caught in adultery in John 8 is you get a Jesus who, at the end of the story, looks at the woman and says, I love you, I affirm you, I include you. And that's all he says. And the problem is that's not the way that the story reads. Jesus looks at her, he loves her, he includes her, of course. Like all bad teaching, it's got a grain of truth in it, but it doesn't go anywhere near far enough. He says, go and sin no more. And Christians have always believed that salvation is meant to lead to a whole different way of life. The people who met Jesus and really heard him on his own terms were never the same again. Sex is just the tip of the iceberg. This is really about authority, scripture, marriage, the church, and nothing less than the shape of the gospel itself.